Somewhere in the Pacific, in the middle of the Second World War, a young American serviceman sat down to write a letter. He was going into combat, or he was already in it. And what he wanted was a knife. Not just any knife, a specific one, made by a specific man, in a small shop in Florida. He did not know the street address. He did not need it. On the envelope, he wrote 3 words, Knife Man, Orlando. And that letter crossed an ocean, moved through the entire machinery of wartime mail, and arrived in the hands of the right person. Because everyone knew who the Knife Man was. That man was B.O. Randall. And the knife that soldier was waiting for would go on to do something almost no other object in American life has done. It would go to war and come home, and go to war again, and come home again, across 3 generations of American men. The same knife your grandfather carried through the Pacific was handed to your father on his way to Vietnam. And a version of that same knife, made the same way by the same hands, is being finished in Orlando right now for a child who has not been born long enough to hold it. This is not the story of a company. Companies rise and fall. This is the story of an object that refused to die, and the men who carried it into the worst places human beings go, and then carried it home, and could never quite bring themselves to put it down. Over the next several minutes, we are going to follow that knife through 3 American wars, and into the drawers and safes where it waits today. Because the knife outlived every war it went to, and it was built to. To understand how a knife ends up going to war 3 times, you have to go back to the first time, and to a man who never intended to make a fighting knife at all. Bo Randall was a citrus man. He managed his family's groves in Central Florida, and knife making was something he did on the side, the way another man might build furniture in his garage on the weekend. He had gotten into it almost by accident. Back in 1936, he had watched a man scraping paint off the hull of a boat with a knife, and the knife was doing this hard, ugly job without chipping or dulling, and Randall walked over to look at it. It was a Skagel made by a craftsman up in Michigan. Randall was struck by it the way some men are struck by a thing that suddenly shows them what is possible. He went home and started trying to make one as good. By 1938, it was a small business. He sold the first ones through his father-in-law's clothing store in Orlando, priced at $16.50, and they sold out. These were hunting knives, sporting knives, knives for outdoorsmen. There was nothing military about them. Then the world changed. When the United States was thrown into the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, it discovered something strange. The country did not have an official fighting knife in its inventory. What it had in storage were leftover trench knives from the First World War. Brass knuckle handled things from 1918 that had never even been issued. So the young men shipping out to North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific did what men have always done. They brought their own. The ones who knew about Bo Randall wanted a Randall. And the ones who could not get to Orlando in person wrote letters. This is the part that sounds invented, except it is documented over and over by the people who were there. A soldier already overseas, or about to be, would write a letter, and on the envelope he would not put a street address, because he did not need one. He would write 3 words, Knife Man, Orlando, and the letter would find Bo Randall. The post office in Orlando knew exactly who the Knife Man was. Somewhere in the Pacific, a young Marine could put those 3 words on an envelope and trust the whole apparatus of the wartime mail to carry his request across an ocean to a small shop in Florida. And it worked. Randall gave the design a name. The Model 1, the all-purpose fighting knife. 8 inches of blade, a curved brass guard, a stacked leather handle that fit the palm. It was strong in a way the specialized daggers of the war were not. You could fight with it, yes, but you could also open a can with it, dress game with it, cut wood with it, pry with it, and it kept its edge through all of it. That was the whole philosophy. A knife should do everything and break at nothing. The demand was more than a handful of men could meet. Between 1942 and 1945, the shop produced 4,000 of these knives for American troops, and even that required help. Around 1,000 of the blades were subcontracted out to the Northampton Cutlery Company up in Springfield, Massachusetts, made to Randall's specification and finished under his name, because Orlando alone simply could not forge them fast enough. They went to remarkable men. General James Gavin, who jumped into Normandy at the head of the 82nd Airborne, carried a Randall. Richard Bong, the highest-scoring American fighter ace of the entire war, carried one. A young Army Air Force captain named Ronald Reagan owned one, and decades later, the country would know him by a different title. But the names on the famous list are not really the point. The point is the thousands of men whose names are on no list at all, who carried a Randall through the worst days of their lives and either came home with it or did not come home. Because that is the quiet arithmetic underneath all of this. 4,000 knives went to war. Not all 4,000 came back. The ones that did came home in a duffel bag and went on to a closet shelf, and they waited. They waited through the late 1940s and into the 50s, sitting quietly in American homes, while the boys who would fight the next war were still children playing in the yard, looking up sometimes at a shelf they were not allowed to reach. There is a war between the two big ones that most people have learned to skip over. It sits in the history books between the World War everyone remembers and the war in the jungle everyone argued about. Korea. They call it the Forgotten War, and the men who fought it have spent 70 years quietly noticing that the name is accurate. The Randall went to Korea too. It just went quietly, the way everything about that war went quietly. By the time the fighting started in 1950, Bo Randall's shop was no longer the tiny operation it had been at Pearl Harbor. The business had boomed after the Second World War. By 1948, the line had grown to 10 models, and the backlog of orders was already starting to build. That slow, steady pile of requests that would define the company for the rest of its existence. But the knife the men carried to Korea was still mostly the old one, the Model 1, the same all-purpose fighter that had gone to the Pacific, a design that had proven itself in one war and simply reported for the next. The men who carried it in Korea were often the same men, or the sons of the same men. This was a country fighting its second major war in a single decade, and the knife on the belt of a soldier in the frozen hills near the Chosun Reservoir might well have been the knife his uncle carried at Guadalcanal. The steel did not care which war it was. It held its edge in the cold, the same way it had held it in the heat. Consider one man, because his story ties the whole thing together. Hal Moore. Most Americans who know the name know it from Vietnam, from the terrible days in the Ia Drying Valley in 1965 that later became a book and a film. But before Vietnam, Hal Moore fought in Korea. 14 months of combat with the 7th Infantry Division, leading a heavy mortar company and then an infantry company through some of the hardest fighting of that war. He was a test jumper for experimental parachutes. He worked directly under General Gavin, the same Gavin who had carried a Randall into Normandy, developing the early concepts of moving infantry by helicopter that Moore would later use in Vietnam. Moore lived inside the whole lineage of the airborne and the Randall knife, from the Second World War through Korea and into the jungle. The thread runs straight through one man's career. That is what Korea really was for the Randall. Not a chapter of its own, so much as a bridge. The knife crossed from the generation that had beaten Japan and Germany to the generation that would go to Vietnam, and Korea was the ground it crossed on. The men who fought there did not get parades. They did not get the books and the movies, at least not for a very long time. They came home to a country that was tired of war and did not especially want to hear about another one. But they came home carrying the same thing their fathers had carried and their sons would carry. And when they put the knife in a drawer, it was the same drawer, in the same kind of American house, waiting for the same thing to happen again. Because it would happen again. It always did. The knife knew that even when the country pretended not to. By 1963, the men going to Vietnam were not the same men who had gone to the Pacific 20 years before, but many of them carried the same thing on their belt. and a good number of them carried the exact same knife their fathers had carried because a Randall did not wear out in one war. It waited for the next one. The knife that defined this generation was the Model 14. Bo Randall had designed it back in the mid-1950s, and he had received a United States patent for it in 1956. It was heavier than the old Model 1, thicker through the spine, a sawtooth top edge on some versions, meant for cutting through the aluminum skin of a downed aircraft. It was not a delicate thing. It was built for a man who might have to cut his way out of a helicopter that was upside down and filling with smoke. The men who carried it into the worst places were the ones who could choose any knife they wanted. Special Forces, the reconnaissance teams working under a command with a name most Americans had never heard, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. On paper, it sounded like an office full of clerks. In practice, it was some of the most dangerous work of the entire war. Small teams crossing borders they were never officially supposed to cross. Those men carried the Model 14, and the records confirm it. But there was a problem, and the problem was time. The demand from Vietnam grew faster than a shop of a few men in Orlando could ever fill. The waiting list stretched out past a year, and a man with orders to ship out in 60 days did not have a year. So Bo Randall did something he had resisted for a long time. He arranged for some of the blades to be forged in Solingen, in Germany, the old center of European blade making, and finished in the Orlando shop. It cut the wait. It let a man going to war actually receive his knife before he left. And still, the men who had the time and the patience wanted the ones forged start to finish in Orlando. They wanted the real thing, even when the copy was made of good steel by good hands. Then there was the Model 18. This one, Vietnam created directly. It was a survival knife, and the handle was the whole idea. It was a hollow steel tube, and inside that tube, a man could carry the small things that keep a person alive when everything else is gone. Fish hooks, matches sealed against the wet, the little pills the army issued to keep a man awake for the third night in a row. The grip was left bare on purpose, so that in the field a man could wrap it himself with fishing line or leather or whatever cord he had, and every one of those wraps was useful later if he needed it. A cap sealed the end. It was a knife designed by people who understood that the most important thing a survival tool can do is still be there when nothing else is. And here is the detail that tells you what the Randall name had come to mean by then. When those cross-border teams went out on the missions that could never be admitted to, they could not carry a knife that said Randall Made, Orlando, Florida on the blade. A stamp like that identifies a body. It tells the other side exactly who sent the man. So the intelligence support unit had copies made in Japan, sterile, unmarked, following the Randall pattern, but carrying no name at all. They were not as good. Everyone who handled both knew they were not as good. But they were shaped like a Randall because the Randall was the shape a fighting knife was supposed to be. Even the fake was a tribute. What did not change was the thing underneath all of it. These knives were expensive. A young man drafted or enlisted did not always have the money for one. And so the pattern that had started in the Pacific repeated itself in the jungle. A father who had carried a Randall through the Second World War took it out of the drawer and handed it to his son. A grandfather did the same for a grandson. The knife that had already survived one war went to another one on the belt of a man who had grown up hearing about it. Blade magazine, years later, put it plainly. They were passed along, father to son, grandfather to grandson. Think about what that means for a moment. A boy grows up in the 1950s seeing a knife on the high shelf of his father's closet, the one he is not allowed to touch, the one that came home from the Pacific. And then in 1968, that same boy, now a young man in uniform, is handed that exact knife by his father, who does not say very much because there is not very much to say. The knife has been to war before, now it is going again. And the father knows something the son does not fully understand yet, which is that if the son comes home, the knife will come home with him. And one day the son will stand in a doorway and hand it to a boy of his own. 1975. The war ended the way it ended. The men came home, or they did not. The knives that came back went into drawers and safes and tackle boxes and got carried on hunts and handed down. And the knives that did not come back are still out there somewhere, in the ground, in a river, in a collection on the other side of the world, or gone entirely, the way most things eventually go. But the ones that made it home outlived the war. That was always the point. A Randall was built to outlive the reason you bought it. Here is the thing nobody tells you about a war knife. Its life in the war is short. Its life after the war is long. A man carries a Randall for a year in the field, maybe 2, maybe 3 if he does multiple tours. And then he comes home and the knife has another 50 years to live. And it lives those 50 years in a house in Ohio or Texas or Montana. And what it does in those years is stranger and quieter than anything it did in combat. Some men use them. There are men who came home and put the knife right into daily life, wore it on the belt every day, used the smaller patterns for cleaning the deer they shot every fall, kept it on their side so long that friends stopped remarking on it. For these men, the knife never stopped being a tool. It went from cutting one kind of thing to cutting another, and the only difference was that nobody was shooting at them anymore. That is the life Bo Randall actually wanted for his knives. He said more than once that his favorite models were the ones meant to be carried and used, day in and day out, year after year. But a great many of them were not used at all. And this is the part that says something true about American men and the things they carry home from war. A man would come back with the knife that had been on his belt through the worst months of his life, and he would clean it and oil it and put it somewhere safe and never take it out again. Into an ammunition box with a light coat of oil, into a sock drawer, into a safe deposit box at the bank. Not because he did not value it, because he valued it too much. The knife had become something he could not risk. It had stopped being a tool the moment it became a witness. You have to understand what the object holds for a man like that. It was there. It was on his belt in a place he does not talk about at dinner. During months he has spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people who were not there. The knife knows something. It is the one object he owns that was physically present for the defining experience of his life. You do not use a thing like that to open boxes. You put it where it is safe, and every so often you take it out and hold it, and something happens in your chest that you could not describe to anyone, and you put it back. And so the same knife that was designed to be used harder than any other knife on the market ends up being the one knife a man will not use at all. That is not a flaw in the design. It is the design succeeding at something Bo Randall never advertised. He built a knife tough enough to go to war and come back. He did not know he was also building the thing a man would hand his grandson from a hospital bed, the object that would carry the whole weight of a life that was mostly never spoken aloud. The knife outlived the war. Then it outlived the work. And in the end, for a great many of these men, the last job the knife ever had was the most important one of all. It was the thing they would leave behind, the proof that they had been somewhere and done something, and that it had mattered. You cannot buy that at any price. You can only earn it and then carry it home and keep it until it is time to pass it on. Which brings us to a knife that has never seen a war and may never see one, and is in some ways the most hopeful object in this entire story. Somewhere in America right now, there is a Randall knife being made for a child who cannot yet lift it. A man ordered it the year his daughter was born. He will wait years for it, the way everyone waits, because the shop in Orlando still makes its knives the same way it always has, by hand. About 20 people, roughly 8,000 knives a year, 17 separate steps, more than 8 hours of work for a single blade. The waiting list runs for years. It has run for years since before Vietnam, and the man ordering the knife for his newborn daughter is not troubled by the wait, because the knife is not for now. It is for later. It is for the day she is old enough, the day she takes her first deer, the day the thing gets placed in her hands, the way these things have always been placed in hands. That knife will be made by the same process that made the knife a Marine rode away from the Pacific with 3 words on an envelope. Nothing about the method has changed. The son and the grandson of Bo Randall still run the shop. The knives are still forged and ground and fitted by human hands, one at a time, slowly, the way they were when a general jumped into Normandy with one on his hip. This is the loop closing, not war to war anymore. War to peace, to the next generation. The knife that a father handed a son on his way to Vietnam is the same kind of knife a father now hands a daughter on her way to her first hunt. The steel does not know the difference. It was only ever built to do one thing, which is to last longer than the reason you bought it, and to still be there when the person you love is ready for it. Go back to 1943 for a moment. A young man in the Pacific writes Knife Man, Orlando on an envelope, and the letter finds its way home because everyone knew who the Knife Man was. Today, you can wait 7 years for one of his knives, and the reason is exactly the same as it was then. Everyone still knows. Some things do not need to be explained. They only need time and hands and someone willing to wait. The Knife Man is gone. The knife is not. It never was the kind of thing that goes away. And if you are watching this on your television, the way most of you are, take a moment to subscribe with your remote. It is the one thing that tells us to keep telling these stories.